She was just a little girl who collapsed at a bus stop. He was a billionaire with a stranger's heart beating in his chest. Neither knew they were already bound by fate. Ethan Gray had left the sleek glass tower of Gray Harbor Technologies that afternoon without his usual entourage, an unusual choice for a man whose every movement was normally calculated and protected. The board meeting had drained him, and the crisp air outside felt like a relief from the endless hum of climate-controlled corridors and the measured tones of executives speaking in percentages. He decided to walk instead of summoning his driver, taking the long way around through a quieter part of the city where the storefronts were small and the pace was slower. It was there, at the corner of Pine and Ninth, that he noticed a figure at the bus stop, a tiny girl in a pink dress, sitting stiffly on the wooden bench, her feet not quite touching the ground. She couldn't have been more than 5. Her brown hair was tied with a worn pink bow that drooped to one side, and in her lap was a half-empty plastic bottle of water. At first Ethan's glance slid over her the way one's eyes skim a stranger in passing, but something about the way her shoulders sagged made him look again. She swayed slightly, as if the bench beneath her had tilted. The bottle rolled from her hands, clattering to the pavement. Her head dipped forward, then back, in a slow, uncoordinated motion, before she simply slid sideways along the bench and crumpled toward the ground. Ethan reacted before thought had a chance to intervene. In 3 long strides he was beside her, catching her just before her temple could strike the metal armrest. She was frighteningly light in his arms, the fragile weight of a bird, and when he brushed the hair from her forehead he felt an unnatural heat radiating from her skin. Her eyelids fluttered, but her eyes remained closed, lashes resting like faint shadows against her cheeks. He searched for some sign of an adult nearby, a parent, a babysitter, anyone, but the only movement came from a couple of strangers glancing over and then hurrying on, unwilling to involve themselves. "Hey," he said softly, leaning closer, the low timbre of his voice meant to coax her back to consciousness. "Come on, little one. Stay with me." There was no response beyond the faint, uneven rhythm of her breathing. A scrape on her knee caught his eye, not fresh, but recent enough to leave a red mark beneath the scab. It looked like she had been walking for some time. Her fingers were small and pale, the nails rimmed with dust. And then he noticed her eyes, half opening for a brief moment. They were startlingly blue, a shade so clear and bright that it was almost unnatural against the tired, flushed face. Something about that color tugged at a place deep inside him, somewhere he rarely let himself go, where half-forgotten images and sensations lived. A yellow cab slowed to the curb, its driver leaning across the passenger seat. "You need help," the man called through the open window, the sharp scent of diesel drifting out with his voice. "Yes," Ethan said, his tone clipped and certain. "Nearest children's hospital. Now." The driver got out to open the rear door, and Ethan settled the girl gently on the seat, keeping her head against his shoulder so it wouldn't loll with the movement. As they pulled into traffic, the city's noise seemed muffled, as if the glass of the taxi had sealed them into a separate world. Ethan could feel each rapid beat of her small heart against his arm, could hear the uneven catch in her breath every few seconds. He reached for his phone to alert the hospital ahead of time, but halfway through dialing he paused, looking down at the fragile figure resting against him. He didn't know her name. He didn't know where she belonged. All he knew was that he was not about to let go of her until someone capable could tell him she would be all right. And as the cab threaded through the afternoon streets, that strange, insistent familiarity about her eyes still echoed in his mind, growing stronger with every block they traveled. The hospital entrance was a blur of glass doors and fluorescent lights as Ethan stepped from the taxi, the girl still cradled against him. The automatic doors whooshed open, releasing a rush of cool, sterile air tinged with the faint scent of antiseptic. Inside, the lobby buzzed with a low murmur of voices, the shuffle of feet, the occasional ring of a phone at the reception desk. Ethan moved quickly toward the nearest nurse, his voice calm but urgent as he explained that the child had collapsed at a bus stop, that she was overheated, possibly dehydrated, and that she hadn't responded to his attempts to rouse her. The nurse, a woman in pale green scrubs with quick, efficient movements, immediately directed him toward the pediatric triage area. As they moved through the hall, a wheelchair was brought forward, but Ethan shook his head and continued to carry her. There was a strange steadiness in his grip, as though setting her down before she was in safe hands would be some sort of betrayal. The triage room was bright, almost harshly lit, the white walls interrupted only by charts and a cheerful mural of sea creatures intended to put children at ease. A second nurse came forward, gently lifting the girl from Ethan's arms and settling her onto the narrow bed. A thin blanket was drawn over her small form while the nurse adjusted the pillow behind her head. "What's her name?" one of them asked without looking up from attaching the pulse oximeter to her finger. "I don't know," Ethan admitted, his voice quieter now. "I found her alone." A third figure entered the room, a man in a white coat with kind but assessing eyes. "I'm Dr. Reeves. Can you tell me exactly what happened?" Ethan recounted the events at the bus stop in as much detail as he could, how she had been sitting alone, how she dropped the bottle, how she had simply collapsed. He described the heat of her skin, the scrape on her knee, the strange lethargy that seemed deeper than a simple faint. Reeves nodded as he listened, his hands moving with practiced precision as he checked her breathing, examined her pupils, and asked the nurse to start in 4. "She's running a high fever," the doctor said, glancing at the monitor. "Pulse is elevated. Blood pressure's low. We'll run some tests, but I can tell you this is more than heat exhaustion." "What do you mean?" Ethan asked, a hint of tension creeping into his voice. Reeves hesitated for a moment before answering, as if measuring what should be said in front of someone who wasn't a legal guardian. "She's underweight for her age. There are signs of prolonged dehydration and poor nutrition. And some of these bruises, they're not all from a fall. They're older." His expression tightened briefly. "Do you have any idea who her parents are?" "No," Ethan repeated, and this time the word came out heavier, more final, because it was the truth and yet felt like a failing. The nurse returned with a small plastic bracelet, already labeled. "We'll call her Lily for now," she said. "It's what's on her paperwork." Ethan's gaze followed the movement of the nurse's hands as she placed the bracelet around the girl's wrist. Lily. The name felt soft, out of place in the clinical brightness of the room, like a scrap of fabric torn from a warmer life. While the 4 bag began to drip and the machines recorded their steady rhythms, a social worker appeared in the doorway. She was holding a clipboard and offered Ethan a polite but guarded smile. "I'll need to speak with you in a few minutes," she said. "We'll have to start tracing her guardians, and there are forms for you to fill out since you brought her in." "I'll sign whatever you need," Ethan replied without hesitation, though his attention had already returned to Lily. She shifted slightly under the blanket, a small frown creasing her brow as though even in sleep she sensed the intrusion of so many unfamiliar voices. He wanted to tell her it would be all right, but it felt presumptuous, almost dishonest, when he couldn't guarantee it. A technician wheeled in a portable monitor and began hooking her up for a series of tests. The screen bloomed with jagged green lines and numbers that meant little to Ethan except that they were irregular enough for the doctor to murmur instructions in a low voice to the nurse. Every movement seemed both routine and urgent, as if they were walking a line between stabilizing her and uncovering what had pushed her to this point. Ethan stood slightly apart, not wanting to interfere, yet every instinct told him to remain close enough to step forward if she needed someone to hold her hand. In the glass reflection of the monitor, he caught his own face, composed on the surface, but with a trace of something he hadn't worn in years, a genuine fear that this small stranger might slip away before anyone could understand why. When Dr. Reeves finally turned back to him, his expression had softened, but the seriousness remained. "We'll keep her here until we understand the full picture. If she wakes up, she may be able to tell us more, but right now she needs rest, fluids, and monitoring." Ethan nodded, though his eyes didn't leave her. "Then I'll wait." The doctor seemed to study him for a moment, as if trying to place why a man in an expensive light blue suit and polished shoes was standing so still in the pediatric ward with no connection to the patient. Whatever conclusion he came to, he didn't voice it, and left with a nod to the nurses. Alone now except for the quiet bustle of medical staff in the background, Ethan moved closer to the bed. Lily's small hand lay on top of the blanket, limp but warm. He hesitated, then rested his own hand gently over hers, feeling the faint but steady beat beneath her skin. Something about that fragile rhythm anchored him in a way he couldn't explain, even to himself. He had walked in here as a stranger doing the decent thing. He wasn't sure what he was now, but he knew he wasn't ready to walk away. The next morning, the pale light filtering through the hospital blinds found Ethan still in the same chair he had taken the night before. He had dozed only in shallow bursts, roused each time by the quiet footfalls of nurses changing 4 bags or checking the monitor. Lily had stirred once in the early hours, her eyelids fluttering halfway open, but she had slipped back into a restless sleep before he could speak to her. The rhythmic beeping of the machines had become part of the air around him, a steady counterpoint to the thoughts circling endlessly in his mind. He was a man who solved problems by dissecting them into measurable pieces, but this situation resisted any such approach. He couldn't define the problem when so much of it was unknown. A knock at the door broke his reverie. A woman stepped inside, her hair pulled into a practical bun, a thin folder clutched against her chest. Her badge identified her as Margaret Leland, Child Protective Services. She greeted him politely, though her eyes moved immediately to Lily, scanning the child with the trained precision of someone who had seen far too many children arrive in similar states. After a moment, she sat down across from him and opened the folder. "We've been able to gather a little information," she began, her tone formal but not unfriendly. "Her name is Lily Evans. She's 5 years old. Her mother was Amelia Evans. No father listed on the birth certificate. According to the records we could access quickly, they were living at the Willow House shelter until about 6 months ago. After that, it seems there was an attempt at placing Lily in a foster arrangement, but the files are incomplete." Ethan felt the sound of the name strike him in a way that was almost physical. Amelia Evans. For a second, the syllables were just sounds, but then something in him shifted, and a deep, uninvited recognition unfurled. He heard them again, but not in Margaret's voice, in the hesitant tone of a hospital liaison, more than a year ago, explaining that the donor's family wished to remain mostly private, but had allowed a single message to be passed on. He remembered reading that message after the transplant, alone in a room still smelling faintly of disinfectant. She loved the ocean. Please live for both of you. There had been a name on the signature line. Amelia Evans. Could you repeat that? His voice was steady, but it felt distant to him, as if he were listening from somewhere else. Amelia Evans, Margaret said again, watching him with mild curiosity. Does that mean something to you? He didn't answer immediately. His hands, resting on his knees, had tightened into fists without him realizing. Of course it was coincidence, he told himself. Evans was not an uncommon name. But that careful rationality was swept aside by the memory of that letter, of the reality that the heart beating in his chest was not the one he had been born with. It had come from a woman who had died unexpectedly, a stranger he had never met but whose final act had given him back his life. He looked at Lily again, at the fine, almost translucent skin of her temples, at the way her lashes curved downward like commas on a page. And those eyes, when she had opened them briefly last night, he had been struck by their startling blue, a shade that seemed too vivid to belong to the muted palette of the hospital. Now he could not unsee the connection. They were her mother's eyes. They were the eyes of the woman whose heartbeat had once been her own and was now his. Margaret continued, flipping through the papers in her folder. Her mother passed away a little over a year ago. Car accident. She was 30. The shelter staff said she was trying to get back on her feet, had applied for job training. After her death, Lily was placed temporarily with a woman named Diane Carter, but that arrangement ended suddenly. We haven't been able to locate Ms. Carter, and Lily was found alone yesterday. That's all we have at this stage. Ethan leaned back slightly, as if distance could dull the impact of her words, but it didn't. The timeline lined up with the day of his surgery, the day he'd been wheeled into a room under two bright lights, convinced he might not wake again. Somewhere else in the city, Amelia Evans had been taking her last breaths. Somewhere else, a child had been losing her mother while he was gaining her heart. He forced himself to focus on Margaret's voice as she outlined the next steps, contacting any remaining relatives, beginning the process for emergency foster care, ensuring Lily's medical needs were met before she was discharged. All of it was logical and procedural, the kind of structure Ethan usually respected, but today it felt inadequate, almost cold, in the face of what he had just learned. When she closed the folder, Margaret gave him a measured look. "You're not related, but you found her and brought her here. That makes you a point of contact for now, at least until we can track down family or a foster home. Will you be reachable if we have questions?" "Yes," he said, the word immediate and without hesitation. But it carried more weight than simple availability. It was a promise he hadn't yet decided how to keep, only that he would. After she left, the room felt quieter than before, though the machine still hummed softly. Ethan stood and moved closer to the bed. He studied Lily's face, trying to imagine Amelia in its lines and curves. He wondered if her mother had laughed easily, if she had been stubborn, if she had sung to her daughter at night. He wondered if she had known, when she signed the donor forms, that part of her might one day meet the child she loved in an entirely different way. The connection was impossible to ignore now. Lily wasn't just a girl he had happened upon by chance. She was the daughter of the woman who had saved him. And as he rested his hand lightly on the rail of her bed, he felt the steady, borrowed heartbeat in his own chest answer some unspoken call, as though it recognized her even if she didn't yet recognize him. Night settled over the hospital in layers of shadow and muted light, the hallways narrowing into quiet corridors where the occasional squeak of rubber soles was the only interruption. Ethan remained in the chair beside Lily's bed, his jacket folded over the armrest, tie loosened and hanging slightly askew. He hadn't intended to stay so long, but each time he thought about leaving, the sight of her small figure beneath the blanket kept him rooted in place. The slow rise and fall of her chest reassured him, though he found himself counting the breaths without meaning to. The monitor beside her bed pulsed with steady green lines, each beep like a soft reminder that the world was still moving forward for her, at least for now. He leaned back and let his gaze drift to the ceiling, the sterile white tiles giving him nothing to focus on. Inevitably, his mind wandered to the night of his own hospitalization. It had been in another building not far from here, but the smell of antiseptic, the faint echo of voices in the hall, the way the lights hummed faintly, all of it was the same. He remembered the way his hands had trembled slightly as they inserted the weight of the consent forms, the realization that without a donor match his chances were vanishingly small. The cardiologist's face had been carefully composed, but Ethan had been in business long enough to recognize the truth behind polite wording. When the call came that a heart was available, relief had flooded him so suddenly it almost felt like pain. He hadn't known anything about the donor then, only that it was a young woman whose family had agreed to the surgery. It was all a blur after that, anesthesia, a black void, and then waking with a pain so deep in his chest it felt as though someone had rearranged his bones. Which, in a sense, they had. In the weeks that followed, he had told himself that survival was enough, that the second chance alone was the repayment. He had even made promises to himself, to live with more purpose, to step away from the endless cycle of meetings and profit margins, to use his time and resources for something more than acquisitions and quarterly growth. But as his body recovered, so too did his old habits. The demands of the company pulled him back into the boardroom, and his silent vows began to fade into the background noise of his life. Now, sitting beside this child, he felt the sharp stab of recognition that he had let that gift drift toward the edges of his consciousness. The rustle of fabric drew his attention back to Lily. Her eyes were half open, clouded with sleep, but she was looking at him. The blue of her irises was softer in the low light, though still so vivid it was almost startling. Her lips parted slightly before she spoke in a voice barely louder than a whisper. "Hi. "Hi," he answered, leaning forward so she didn't have to strain. "You're awake." She studied him for a moment, as though trying to place him in her mind. "You glow," she said, her tone matter of fact, as if she were simply describing the weather. A faint smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "That's just the hospital lights." She shook her head once, slow and deliberate. "Not the lights. You." Her gaze drifted to his chest, where beneath his shirt and tie lay the faint scar from the transplant. "Your heart was sick before." The word sent a shiver through him. "Yes," he admitted. "But it's better now." "Who fixed it?" He hesitated. How could he explain to a 5-year-old the layers of coincidence, tragedy, and generosity that had converged to place them here together? Yet something in her expression, open, expectant, trusting, made him feel the truth was the only option. "Your mom," he said softly. "She helped me." For a moment she didn't respond, her gaze drifting past him toward the shadows in the corner of the room. Then she turned back, her expression calm, as if she had been told something she already understood in some quiet, unspoken way. She closed her eyes again, her small hand curling slightly beneath the blanket, and within moments her breathing evened into the rhythm of sleep. Ethan sat there for a long while afterward, the weight of the exchange settling in him like a stone in deep water. There was no clear plan in his mind, no strategy for what came next, but he knew with absolute certainty that this was no chance encounter to be filed away as a passing act of kindness. The heart in his chest, her mother's heart, beat in steady time, and for the first time in months he felt it as something more than muscle and tissue. It was a link, a responsibility, a promise renewed. And whatever shape that promise would take, he was not going to let it fade again. Morning arrived reluctantly, the pale light creeping through the blinds in thin strips that fell across the foot of Lily's bed. The quiet hum of the hospital night gave way to the muted clatter of carts in the hallway and the soft murmur of staff beginning their rounds. Ethan had barely moved from his chair, his mind refusing to let him drift into real sleep. He had been waiting for answers, though he was starting to realize that the answers he feared were the ones most likely to come. When the door opened, it was Dr. Reeves again, accompanied by Margaret Leland from Child Protective Services. Both carried the look of people who had gathered more information than they wished they had. Margaret sat down without preamble, placing her folder on her lap. Her voice was calm, but there was no mistaking the heaviness in her tone. "We've confirmed the details I told you yesterday," she began, glancing briefly at Lily before continuing. "Amelia Evans died in a car accident just over a year ago. It was sudden, no prior health conditions, nothing anyone could have anticipated. She was declared brain dead upon arrival at the hospital, and her family consented to organ donation." Ethan felt the weight of that statement settle over him, not because it was news, but because it was now bound to this room, this moment, this child. Margaret went on, explaining that after Amelia's death, Lily had been placed in emergency foster care with a woman named Diane Carter, a temporary arrangement meant to last only until a more permanent placement could be found. Diane had no other children and had passed the basic screening, but 3 months into the arrangement, she had stopped responding to calls from the agency. According to what little the case file revealed, there had been no official termination of the placement, Diane simply vanished from contact. A welfare check at her registered address had turned up nothing. The apartment was empty, the lease terminated. Dr. Reeves spoke next, his hands in his coat pockets, his voice carrying the measured cadence of someone delivering clinical facts without softening them unnecessarily. "Lily's current condition reflects more than just the incident at the bus stop. She has signs of chronic dehydration and malnutrition. There are indications she hasn't had consistent meals for weeks, possibly longer. Some of her bruises are old, at different stages of healing. None of them appear to be the result of a single accident. These are the kinds of patterns we see when a child hasn't been receiving adequate care for an extended period." Ethan listened, each sentence tightening the knot in his chest. The picture forming was one of neglect, abandonment, and the quiet kind of suffering that leaves no immediate scars but steals strength one day at a time. He could almost see it, Lily left alone for long stretches, finding scraps of food, perhaps trying to drink from the same warm bottle of water he had seen roll from her hands at the bus stop. The image sat in his mind like a weight he could not dislodge. Margaret's voice cut back in. We'll begin formal proceedings to locate her next of kin. If none can be found, we'll look at temporary foster arrangements. Given her medical state, she'll remain here for several days, but once she's stable, placement will be necessary. We can't release her without an approved guardian. She hesitated, and for a moment her professional detachment softened. You've been here since you brought her in. You clearly care. But unless you have a legal connection to her, your role ends when she leaves this hospital. Ethan didn't answer right away. He stared at the blanket rising and falling with Lily's breathing, thinking of how little it would take for her to disappear into the system, one form, one case number, one line in an overburdened file. He thought of the letter from Amelia's family, their request that he live for both of them, the unspoken link that had already bound him to this child before he even knew her name. What happens if you can't find anyone? He finally asked. Margaret sighed, not unkindly. Then she'll go into foster care. It's not always ideal, but we have dedicated families. We do our best to keep siblings together, though in this case there are none. She's young, so her chances of finding a placement are higher than older children. Still, the transition is hard, especially after. She trailed off, gesturing faintly toward the bed. Dr. Reeves excused himself to check on another patient, leaving Ethan alone with Margaret. She closed her folder, preparing to leave as well, but paused at the door. If you truly want to help her, there are ways to stay involved. Donations to the shelter she came from, funding for programs. That's not what I mean, Ethan interrupted, his voice quieter but more certain. I'm not talking about funding programs. I'm talking about Lily. Margaret studied him for a moment, measuring the man in the tailored suit who had sat for hours in a pediatric ward with no legal claim to the child in the bed. Then you'd have to go through the same process as anyone else, background checks, home evaluations, the full application. It's not simple, and it's not fast. Ethan's answer came without hesitation. Then start it. She gave a small nod, not promising but acknowledging his intent, and left the room. The door closed with a soft click, leaving Ethan in the muted hum of the machines once again. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees, his eyes fixed on the small figure beneath the hospital blanket. He thought of Amelia's last day, the moment his life had been returned to him, and realized that this was not an unrelated act of kindness or a chance encounter. It was the continuation of a promise he had let fade once and would not allow to fade again. Somewhere in the stillness, he felt the borrowed heart in his chest beat in quiet, steady agreement. The first whispers began the day after Ethan's meeting with Margaret. He had left the hospital only briefly to change clothes and attend a scheduled strategy session at Gray Harbor Technologies, expecting to keep his focus on the quarterly numbers and the integration of a recent acquisition. But as soon as he stepped into the conference room, he noticed the sidelong glances, the way conversations lowered in volume when he passed. His assistant placed a folded printout in front of him before the meeting began. It was a headline from an online gossip site, accompanied by a blurred photo taken outside the hospital, "Billionaire CEO seen leaving pediatric ward with unidentified child." The accompanying text was speculative, suggesting everything from a secret daughter to a PR stunt. By the time the meeting ended, the story had been picked up by business blogs and was trending on social media, each repost distorting the facts a little further. Later that afternoon, he was summoned to a private session with the board's executive committee. The room was smaller than the main conference hall, the kind of space where difficult conversations were held behind closed doors. Several board members sat in a semicircle, their expressions varying between curiosity and concern. The chairman, an older man named Robert Ellison, leaned forward with his fingers steepled. "Ethan, we've been monitoring a developing situation. You've been photographed multiple times at the Children's Hospital. The media has noticed, and the speculation is unpredictable. Is there something we should be aware of? Ethan kept his voice measured, though a flicker of irritation passed through him. I found a young girl collapsed at a bus stop and took her to the hospital. She's in care now. That's all there is to know. One of the newer members, a sharp-tongued investor named Mason Clark, gave a thin smile. All. That may be enough to cause reputational questions, especially if people start assuming connections or motives. We have shareholders who care about stability, not tabloid drama. The PR director, who had been called in for the meeting, suggested they craft a short statement, something vague about Ethan's commitment to community well-being, without specifics. If we avoid feeding the story, it may fade on its own, she advised. But for now, I'd recommend limiting public appearances until this dies down. Ethan listened, his jaw tightening. The way they spoke about Lily, though they didn't know her name, reduced her to a variable in a risk calculation. He understood corporate caution, but the dissonance between their priorities and the reality of a small child in a hospital bed was jarring. He had sat in rooms like this for years, weighing risks against returns, but in this instance, the equation felt obscene. Then came the comment that shifted the air in the room. Ellison, still leaning forward, said, "Ethan, you're acting emotionally. That's not always the best approach in leadership." The words might have passed without note on another day, but something in Ethan snapped, not in anger exactly, but in a deep rejection of the premise. He met the older man's gaze evenly. "My emotional is the reason this company exists in the first place," he said. "I built it by caring about what I was doing more than anyone else in the room. And right now, I care about making sure that little girl survives and has a future. If that's bad for business, then maybe it's time to rethink what kind of business we're in." The silence that followed was long enough for him to hear the faint ticking of the wall clock. A few board members exchanged uneasy glances. The PR director shifted in her seat but didn't interrupt. Finally, Ellison sat back, his expression unreadable. "No one is questioning your right to personal involvement. We're simply asking that you be mindful of the optics." "I'll be mindful," Ethan replied, standing to leave. "But I won't be absent." By the end of the week, the story had spread further, but instead of retreating, Ethan chose to address it head-on. He called a press conference in the company's main atrium, a space usually reserved for product launches and quarterly earnings announcements. Cameras crowded the back, reporters lined up with notepads and recorders. When he stepped to the podium, he didn't read from prepared notes. He spoke plainly, explaining how he had found Lily, the circumstances that had brought her to the hospital, and the fact that her mother had been the donor whose heart had saved his life. "This isn't a publicity stunt," he said to the assembled press. "It's not about optics or image management. It's about responsibility, the kind that doesn't end when the story leaves the headlines. Her mother gave me my life. I'm not going to stand by while her daughter's is left to chance." The statement rippled through the media almost instantly, reframing the narrative. The next morning's coverage was mixed, some praised his candor, others questioned his motives, but public interest had shifted from gossip to genuine curiosity. Within days, messages began arriving from other families with similar stories, and a quiet idea in the back of Ethan's mind solidified into a plan. He announced the formation of the Harbor Hearts Foundation, dedicated to supporting children from unstable or dangerous home situations, with programs for nutrition, medical care, and legal advocacy. 2% of Gray Harbor Technologies' annual profits would be allocated to the foundation, supplemented by Ethan's personal contribution. It was a significant sum, large enough to make some shareholders wince, but the announcement was met with applause from employees who had grown weary of purely profit-driven headlines. Still, Ethan knew this wasn't about applause. The foundation was more than a gesture, it was a way to create structure where there had been none, to ensure that what had happened to Lily would not happen again to someone else if he could help it. And beneath all the formal announcements and carefully chosen words was a simpler truth he didn't voice publicly: this was his way of honoring Amelia's gift and protecting the only piece of her still left in the world. It took nearly 2 weeks before Margaret informed him that a temporary custody arrangement could be made, allowing Lily to leave the hospital with him under the supervision of Child Protective Services. The process had been a blur of paperwork, background checks expedited by his resources, and several unannounced home visits by caseworkers who seemed quietly surprised to find the top floor of a luxury high-rise stripped of the usual sterile opulence and instead filled with warm light, fresh flowers, and an unusual number of blankets. When the day came, Lily walked out of the hospital holding his hand, her other hand clutching the music box he had brought for her days earlier. She wore a soft sweater over her dress, her hair freshly washed by one of the nurses, the pink bow slightly askew but determinedly in place. His apartment was vast, perched high above the city, with glass walls that let in a sweep of skyline. Yet when they stepped inside, the space seemed almost too big for the two of them. The living room, with its clean lines and neutral tones, felt more like a magazine layout than a home. Lily wandered in cautiously, looking around as though she had entered a museum, careful not to touch anything until he told her she could. Her footsteps were small and deliberate on the hardwood floors, and she stopped in front of the floor-to-ceiling windows, staring at the distant traffic and the tiny figures moving far below. "It's high," she said after a moment, without turning around. "It is," Ethan agreed, standing beside her. "But it's safe. You can see everything from up here." She didn't answer, only pressed her nose closer to the glass, as if the city were a puzzle she was trying to solve. He realized then that his home, for all its elegance, offered little comfort to someone her age. The clean surfaces and muted palette were meant for efficiency, not warmth, and so he began changing it piece by piece in the days that followed. The first change was the kitchen. On their second morning, he took her to a small corner grocery, the kind of place he rarely visited, and let her pick out anything she wanted. She chose cinnamon sticks, a bag of flour, and a jar of strawberry jam, none of which he had in his cabinets. That evening, they baked cookies together. Flour dusted her hair, and she laughed when he pretended to sneeze clouds of sugar. The smell of cinnamon filled the apartment, curling into the corners and softening the edges of the sleek modern space. In the guest bedroom that was now hers, he replaced the monochrome bedding with a quilt patterned in bright coral and sea blue squares. A small bookshelf appeared against the wall, stocked with picture books and a handful of stuffed animals. On the nightstand sat the ocean-painted music box, its gentle melody filling the room each night before she fell asleep. She wounded herself, always 3 turns exactly, as though more might make the tune too loud. One evening, a week after she had moved in, Ethan found an old envelope in a file marked "Personal Correspondence." It was the letter from Amelia's parents, the one he had read only once after the transplant before tucking it away. They had written of her love for the ocean, her stubborn determination, her kindness. At the end, there had been a line he had not fully understood then: "If the world allows, we would like to meet you one day." He had assumed that moment would never come. Now, it seemed almost inevitable. He made the call that same night. The voice on the other end was warm but cautious, as though bracing for bad news. When he explained who he was, there was a long pause, and then a quiet intake of breath. They agreed to meet in the park near the harbor the next afternoon. Lily was shy at first when they arrived, holding tightly to his hand. Joan and Mark Evans were waiting on a bench overlooking the water, their hands clasped together, their faces lined with the kind of grief that time dulls but never erases. They stood as Ethan approached, their eyes moving from him to the little girl beside him. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Joan knelt to Lily's level, her voice trembling slightly as she said, "You have your mother's eyes." Mark simply placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder and gave a single nod, the weight of gratitude in the gesture needing no words. The afternoon passed quietly. They walked along the water, Lily skipping ahead to look at boats moored along the pier, returning occasionally to show Joan a shell or a feather she had found. Ethan watched them, feeling as though a missing piece of a story had been placed back into the book of their lives. When the sun began to dip, Joan pressed a small, worn seashell into Lily's hand. "Your mom kept this on her desk," she said softly. She said it made her feel like she could hear the ocean, even when she couldn't see it. Back at the apartment that evening, Lily placed the shell beside her music box on the nightstand. She didn't say anything about it, but he noticed she wound the box an extra turn before bed, as if making space for the shell's silent song. For Ethan, the room no longer looked like a guest space. It looked lived in. The once echoing apartment now carried the sound of small footsteps, the murmur of bedtime stories, and the occasional burst of laughter from the kitchen. What had been a penthouse designed for efficiency had begun to feel like a home, not because of its contents, but because of the person who now filled it. As he closed her door that night, he realized the changes he had made were not temporary adjustments for a guest. They were the beginning of something permanent, whether or not the legal documents reflected it yet. And though he had not planned for any of this, he understood with absolute certainty that he did not want his life to return to the way it had been before she arrived. The court hearing took place on a bright morning in early spring, the kind of day when the air carried a hint of warmth but still clung to the cool sharpness of winter. Ethan arrived early with Lily, walking her through the grand entrance of the family courthouse, their footsteps echoing against the marble floors. She wore a pale yellow dress that Joan had chosen for her, a ribbon tied neatly in her hair, and she clutched the small music box in both hands. The waiting area was filled with other families, some tense, some relieved, all caught in the strange limbo that legal proceedings seemed to create. Ethan kept his arm gently around her shoulders, sensing that she was taking in more than she let on, her gaze moving quietly from one face to another. The hearing itself was not dramatic, though the weight of its outcome was enormous. The judge, a woman with silver-streaked hair and a direct gaze, reviewed the reports from Child Protective Services, the evaluations of Ethan's home, and the statements from doctors and social workers. Margaret testified to the circumstances under which Ethan had found Lily, describing his consistent presence during her hospital stay and his cooperation with every step of the custody process. Dr. Reeves spoke of her condition upon admission and the improvement she had made since living with Ethan. Joan and Mark had come as well, offering their support for his petition, their voices steady but tinged with the emotion of seeing their granddaughter safe and cared for. When the judge finally spoke, her words were measured and deliberate, each sentence carrying the finality of law. She granted Ethan permanent guardianship of Lily, with the process for adoption to begin after the mandatory trial period. The sound of her gavel striking the block seemed to echo far longer than it should have, and for a moment, Ethan simply sat still, letting the reality settle in. Lily turned to him with a small, almost hesitant smile, and he felt her fingers curl around his. Outside, the sunlight felt warmer than when they had entered. Joan and Mark hugged Lily tightly, promising to visit soon, and Mark placed a hand on Ethan's shoulder again, the gesture silent but heavy with trust. As they walked toward his car, Lily tilted her head up to look at him. "Can I call you my captain?" she asked suddenly. "Because you're from Harbor." The corners of his mouth lifted, and he nodded. "You can call me that." The months that followed were filled with the quiet work of building a life together. The Harbor Hearts Foundation grew quickly, opening its first community center in a renovated brick building on the east side of the city. The center offered free breakfasts before school, a small library, counseling rooms, and a legal clinic for families in crisis. Ethan visited often, sometimes with Lily in tow, introducing her to staff and volunteers. He didn't speak about her publicly unless she chose to be part of the conversation, but when she played the music box's melody on the small upright piano in the center's main room, people listened in silence, understanding without needing the story spelled out. Not everyone understood his choices. Some in the business press still called it a vanity project, a distraction from his corporate responsibilities. He ignored those voices, focusing instead on the tangible changes he could see: children walking into the center with uncertain expressions and leaving with a bag of food, a warm coat, or simply the knowledge that someone knew their name and cared that they were there. The work felt like a continuation of something begun long before he had consciously chosen it, as though Amelia's gift had carried with it a directive he had only now begun to fulfill. A year after the court's decision, they visited the beach that Amelia had loved. It was late afternoon, the horizon awash with the soft gold and rose tones of a setting sun. Joan tied a new pink bow in Lily's hair while Mark helped her launch a bright red kite into the wind. The string hummed in her hands as the kite climbed higher, its tail flicking in the breeze. Ethan stood a few steps back, watching, the music box in his hand. When he wound it and let the melody drift out over the sand, the sound mingled with the rhythmic crash of waves. Lily turned to him, the wind tugging at the hem of her dress. "Do you hear it?" she asked, her voice carrying just enough to reach him. "Mom's smiling." He nodded, feeling the truth of it in a way that went beyond words. The heart in his chest beat steadily, strong and certain, and for the first time in his life, he felt no distance between the life he was living and the life he was meant to live. What had begun as a chance encounter at a bus stop had become a binding thread, pulling together past and present into a whole that neither tragedy nor time could unravel. And as the sun sank lower, painting the water in streaks of gold, he knew this was not an ending at all, but the kind of beginning that lasts a lifetime. To me, the ending of this story isn't just about a billionaire adopting a little girl, it's about the way one act of love can ripple through time, binding people who might never have crossed paths otherwise. Amelia's decision to become a donor was made in a moment she'd never lived to see, yet it shaped every choice Ethan made afterward. What began as a random act of compassion at a bus stop turned into a promise kept across years, loss, and second chances. It's a reminder that fate isn't always a sudden twist, sometimes it's a long, invisible thread, quietly pulling two lives toward the same shore until they finally meet. And when they do, the ending isn't about closing a chapter, but about finally starting the right one.